Just before we start, we'd like to gently remind you that if you enjoy this podcast as much as we do, then we'd really appreciate it if you gave us a rating or a review on Apple or Spotify, if you liked or subscribed to us on YouTube, or even just, tell the dads at school, pick up the people you play football with at Power League, the faceless humans that you count as friends because they occasionally give you kudos on Strava. Tell them about us, and that helps us keep doing what we're doing. And now we'll get on with it. Welcome to Libero, the podcast about the most important of the most important things, as the great Sandro Mazzola once said. I'm Rory Smith of The Observer and Men in Blazers, and I am joined today by Miguel Delaney, the award-winning author of Stuttgart to Saipan and chief football correspondent.
It was the other one.
The Independent, and Jonathan Wilson of the Jonathan Wilson Extended Universe. How are you both doing?
Yeah, not too bad. It's a lovely sunny day where I am in Ireland.
Is it as warm in Ireland as it is in across the water?
It is not. It's usually always at least 5 degrees cooler in summer anyway, but it seems like it's significant. It's very pleasant in Ireland. It's a good 20 degrees, whereas I hear London is 30.
Stinking hot. Awful.
Yeah. Wilson's unhappy.
Yeah, I tried to go for a run this morning, and well, yes, but I won't let it change how I dress. That's the most important thing.
Jonathan is still
essentially, I'm bigger than the weather.
Did you go for a run in a blazer?
I'm not wearing a blazer now. I'm wearing a linen shirt now. I went for a run in a Nike sports shirt. And if Nike want to sponsor us, then they're very welcome to.
Do you have anyone to meet after this?
I've got a meeting after this, yeah.
Is that why you're wearing a shirt?
No, I just thought I'd look smart.
Miguel seemed slightly appalled by the idea of you just wearing a shirt casually.
Just at home. like a Victorian gentleman.
The linen shirt is very much the adulterer abroad look, which I think we should all be encouraging. Today we are talking about transfers, although we're not really. We're actually talking about transfers, and we will acknowledge straight away that we are fully aware of the irony that is kind of inherent within that. And we're exposing our own hypocrisy because we think this is actually quite an interesting thing. It's the sort of thing we actually talk about quite a lot when we are in private, not leveraging our lives for content. The transfer industry, as I think it's a bit pretentious to call it that, but it's probably what it is something that we do, consider quite a lot, even though, Miguel, it's kind of just you, really, that covers it in any real detail of the three of us.
Yeah, I suppose it's one part of my job. Well, it's like in the same way you get a news line, you do a news line. You get a transfer line, which tends to be quite abundant, and there's a lot we don't do. And you cover it. But, of course, I think what the key really here is, I suppose, how it does feel like, I don't want to overuse this phrase, like the media industrial complex, but that's what the transfer industry is now. It feels like there's football coverage, and then there's football transfer coverage, to the point, of course, you've got really specialist journalists, and I know there's a debate about, the exact use of that phrase in relation to some, who solely cover transfers.
Can I just ask a question that might annoy Evgeny Lebedev? What, you often hear people say that transfer stories are clickbait. Does that hold true? Because my general perception, and Jonathan, I don't know whether you kind of go along with this. My general perception is there are certain clubs that if you write about them, you attract a larger audience than if you write about others, and those clubs are Liverpool, Arsenal, Manchester United, probably
maybe Chelsea.
Maybe
just about
Chelsea. I'd say
not to the same degree. United, Chelsea, and Liverpool. Sorry, United, Arsenal, and Liverpool are on a totally different dimension, I'd say.
And then to me, it's like Chelsea, and actually weirdly, maybe Spurs sort of fourth, with City pushing up there, and then the Spanish big two.
Newcastle and Leeds do really well in that sense.
Really?
Yeah.
But do you find that if you get a decent, not like a world shaking exclusive, if you got a decent Newcastle transfer line, what sort of would you notice a general spike in traffic? Would that perform better than a piece about sports washing?
Well, funny, that's an interesting one actually, because I do find with some of the and we're into a whole other area of debate here, with some of the state-owned clubs, discussion about kind of some of the wider topics, does performance better, say, than necessarily kind of some football angle? But on the other side, transfers are I do actually think that, and I suppose this is why the industry has grown or evolved in this way, in terms of, unless there's some sort of outlandish news story, a genuine kind of game-changing news story, that transfers really kind of drive so much of football coverage. And like they attract numbers that very little. Sorry, they attract numbers that very little single other topics can compare to. Yeah, an individual story can do well, but just as a kind of a constant thing. And like obviously, I mean, to touch on your question, I suppose, clickbait. I think the phrase obviously been completely misused now, and I think it's misapplied because to me, clickbait is something kind of just something that's tangentially correct that you use basically to get engagement. Whereas even still, I think even in the transfer industry, like it's what has happened is, whereas before, I think you might collate a lot of info you receive into one piece. And I think this actually distinction now begins to drive a lot of the window. Single pieces of info on their own can actually kind of drive immense coverage. So like there's almost a duty in that sense to your employer as well to kind of put that out, even if it's a small bit of info.
I think there's sort of two elements of this. There's the more serious end where people are genuinely trying to find out what's going on, which clubs are trying to sign which players are unsettled and looking for a move or whatever. Follows essentially the same ethical patterns as any other kind of journalism. But then there's a whole, maybe even the larger section of it, which is wildly speculative. And I've been trying to work this out since we decided this was a topic we were going to do today. I've been trying to work out whether I think this because I work in the industry and I know the people involved, or whether sort of fans do this as well. And I suspect certainly sort of the most engaged fans understand this. Some journalists are sort of are very reliable, and some are telling a good story. And it appears that people don't expect quite the same level of sourcing for transfer story as they do for other things. And I think things have changed. I think the fact that clicking on stories, you can have a very clear metric for how popular stories are. But this has always been part of our industry.
Yeah.
So the classic tabloid way of doing things would be you write a very speculative story, you follow it up with a denial, and then you write about what the consequences of that denial and Club X not going for player A might be. And then if you're a stringer or a freelancer and you're getting paid per story, there's 3 stories in 3 days. I won't name him, but there's a journalist we both know whose favourite line is, "The truth makes a good follow-up."
So this I find really interesting. Is you are veering from my script, Jonathan, and I don't like that. It sort of makes me feel slightly uncomfortable.
You got to be Libero.
Libero has to be very structured. That was the key of all those systems. So obviously, like Miguel alluded to them earlier, there is this kind of perception that the transfer industry has grown over the course of the last, say, 30 years as more money's flooded into football, as football has basically become more about money, and you get like Sky Sports News and blah, blah, blah. And then the natural kind of culmination of that is Fabrizio Romano and David Ornstein. And all three of us know Orny and like Orny. He's a really good journalist. He's very thorough.
Brilliant contact. He kind of, a lot of the stuff, not only does he get from his own sourcing, but he works with a lot of the other reporters of The Athletic, all of whom have their own contacts. David Ornstein is reliable. Fabrizio, I think certainly two of us have maybe slightly opposing views on. I quite admire Fabrizio's chutzpah. I think he's essentially, in a world full of, genuine evils, I think Fabrizio Romano is not one of them. But there is, he I think is a much more interesting case study. I think there's an interesting thing there whereas David is obviously very much a journalist. Fabrizio has kind of evolved into a part of, it feels, the kind of football as entertainment. So I mean, the very fact that like he's appearing in, is it ads for FIFA, or he's like talking to the
ads for FIFA.
I mean, like as a journalist, you shouldn't do that because you can easily leap from covering a transfer to having to cover a FIFA story. Well,
except you don't, because I don't think, in Fabrizio's defence, I don't think he often reports on anything that isn't at least sort of connected to transfers. So he may well, and I wouldn't claim to be like a student of his oeuvre, but he may well do stories on dressing room rows and stuff like that, players falling out with managers, but it's all kind of connected to the transfer world. I don't think I've ever seen Fabrizio do a story, maybe a bit of Super League stuff. But I don't think I've ever really seen.
Yeah, but isn't that stage though? Once you're in that sphere and you have all these contacts, anything can actually evolve into a story quite easily.
100%. Yeah,
So sort of, I think the issue is more like how the kind of boundaries are blurred, basically.
So we'll come on to that in a second. But what I wanted to ask both of you is how different do we think that is from the way things used to work, the world that we all kind of just about emerged in? I will again not name this journalist, but there was quite a famous tabloid reporter who was around for a long, long time, who had a lot of kind of very close relationships with managers and executives at certain teams, and he placed stories that were in their interests, that you would see that club linked with a player who they were not actually looking at, and it was put there basically so the manager or the executive could go to a player in their squad and say, look, we're thinking about this replacement, you better sign that contract, or it would smoke out interest from another team and another player. It was all designed to kind of maneuver the market. Is there a risk that when, as journalists, we look at those transfer influences, maybe is the best way of putting it, that we are romanticising a past that never existed? This has always been a little bit of a murky business.
Yeah, and actually, the best example of that is when West Germany wanted Franz Beckenbauer to be their manager, and Beckenbauer was very reluctant to do it. And so Beckenbauer's agent and the DFB, the German Football Association, put out a story in Bild saying, Franz, it's now. And the public pressure was such, Beckenbauer was like, oh, okay, I'll do it. And he agreed to a short-term deal and then stayed on. So that's a very clear manipulation, not even of the market, but of life. So there's never been a time when journalists have been purer than pure. And to an extent, you're always picking and choosing. I mean, we've been talking about people doing adverts. At some point, we hope that we have adverts on this show. It's the only way we're going to make any money out of it. And fun as this is, none of us are doing it as a charity. And we've got to be.
That will affect our VAT status, just so you know.
I mean, arguably positively. So could we be a charity? I don't know, because yeah. I mean, if private schools could be, like we seem like we're also educating. But we've got to be pretty careful about what adverts we accept, and any kind of advert could ultimately end up connecting back to football and a story we have to write. So you've got to be very. These are not sort of clear lines. There are some clear lines. I mean, I remember I was in Argentina at the Copa America in 2011. I was at a Venezuela game, and there was an English agent said to me early in the second half, that Venezuela winger's playing well, isn't he? And he was playing well. And I was like, yeah. I'd like to look at him. He went, give you 50 quid if you mention him in your match report. And I was like, just walk away. Like, please, stop talking to me. I'm now not going to mention... If he scores a goal, I've got to mention him, but I'm now not discussing that player because that has crossed an ethical line. So that's a very easy one. But, yeah, sort of doing little favours for contacts, suppressing stories because you think that further down the line you might get something bigger out of it. Those are decisions that everybody's making all the time, and they're really... there's no real hard and fast rule. I sort of essentially feel that in your gut if it feels right, and you've got to judge it on a case-by-case basis. But that's quite an unsatisfactory moral code.
Well, I did a story with Fabrizio when I was at the NYT, and he was kind of on his kind of remarkable trajectory upwards. And one of the things he said was that he works with a lot of agents now, and I mean his Genesis story we probably need Horncastle for really, but I think to an extent one of the things I quite like about Fabrizio Romano is that he's a kid who took a chance, and I think that should be like encouraged.
There was hard work as well, to be fair.
He's, like, I mean, that man never sleeps. Like, he's not. I don't think.
Well, even in the sense of like hearing stories, kind of he's told about going and like just hanging around restaurants or hotels in Milan, this sort of thing. Like that is traditional journalist donkey work, really.
Yeah, it's what do they call it? Shoe leather journalism, don't they?
Yeah,
like, wandering around these. I mean, all right, it's fancy hotels in Milan. It's not like walking the streets of Baltimore, but like he's in nice places. But no, I think Fabrizio put the work in. He tried. He obviously worked out. He was smart enough to see that there's a niche, to see there's a demand for this transfer stuff. But he said to me that if an agent says, look, this deal's about to be done, then but we don't want it out just yet, he'll hold it. And part of me, I remember saying to my editor at the NYT, like, he does this, and the NYT, which I love working for the NYT. This isn't a criticism, but there's the Marina Hyde line that American journalism would be great if only it took itself more seriously. My editor at the NYT was appalled by this, but I kind of thought, well, we all do that. Like, there's been at the Club World Cup, which none of us are currently at. There's been big rows about embargoes. It's 2025. What are you talking about embargoes for? Like, journalism, certainly football journalism, there has always been a bit of an unspoken convention that you will hold stuff for a little while so as not to piss off the source who gave it to you. And I think that probably isn't something you'd teach in journalism school, but probably not doing any great harm. It's just part of the trade craft, isn't it?
Yeah, there's a bit of that, all right, yeah.
So do we think that what point do the transfer influences diverge from what has always been the vaguely murky world of transfers?
Just before, maybe in terms, this is something we could do in the editing, but just because I wanted to pick up on that point. Barney makes the kind of the argument that one distinction between just exclusively transfers is that transfers basically, especially if you're reporting on those that actually happen, and like there's not 90% of them or 90% of negotiations don't, but you're reporting something that is going to be released in a press release eventually. It's not information that people don't want in the public domain. Okay, maybe at a certain point because of a certain sensitivity in negotiation, and at which point this opens the discussion of how much clubs actually like all this. But ultimately, I suppose it's that distinction between something that's going to be reported as happening eventually in some way between something that people don't want out there.
Yeah, I mean, Barney's made that point to all of us, I think, and I get what he means. I think it's slightly disingenuous, if I'm completely honest. As a great Barney Ronay admirer, I find it hard to say that, but I find it slightly baffling, that thing of there's clearly, and it's not something I've ever been part of, but there's clearly a thing where clubs will say we are going to announce this signing at 5:00, and various journalists will go at 4:59, and it will basically be blurred that they can claim the exclusive or they can claim to have beaten the news, but basically they've beaten it by a minute. But at the same time, I once stopped James Maddison signing for Liverpool. So getting stories can genuinely have an impact. They were looking at him. Well, so they were looking at him when he was at Coventry, and they made a bid. And I happened to be speaking to a friend of mine who was running Coventry at the time, who mentioned that they'd had this offer from Liverpool for James Maddison, this 19-year-old, who I think at that stage everyone thought was going to be really good, but he wasn't like a superstar. And basically Liverpool, when it got kind of leaked into the public domain, I was told years later, Liverpool got annoyed because they thought that Coventry were trying to do it to smoke out interest. So the negotiations stalled, and at that point, I think Norwich came in for him and he signed for Norwich and then got on loan to Aberdeen. I think that's what Maddison did. But basically, if that story hadn't emerged, James Maddison probably would have signed for Liverpool. But just by chance, I was talking to my mate, and I think getting stories like that is, I mean, even though that one then didn't happen because of me, like, that is legitimate. It's a legitimate form of journalism. That is information that Liverpool clearly didn't want out in the public domain at that point. It's
a funny one, that one as well, actually, because and this touches on kind of like whether the club is like this, and I do actually think it might even split along kind of super club lines, unless like unless lesser resourced clubs are at a genuinely sensitive point in negotiations and the kind of information went out. We do know that some of them actually specifically love being covered by David or Fabrizio, because that generates a lot of noise for them. It creates exposure. On the other side, I know I've spoken to people like some of the Premier League's big six who get really aggravated with if they're trying to negotiate for a player, and there's just this constant noise of updates. It's not so much the updates that annoys them. It's actually more the kind of the pressure it puts on the club from, like, anytime they put it on social media, even some sort of charity campaign or whatever, and all they get are responses basically announce whoever, what's going on with this. So it kind of adds to the intensity of it all. And obviously, I suppose this is one other way. I mean, we've discussed the idea of content a lot on the pod, as a pod that is itself content, as some commentators. Content now. Yeah. But it does contribute to the way football is now 24/7. Like, the news cycle is relentless, and it's for some journalists, I suppose specifically David and Fabrizio in this sense, like, this is actually their busiest time of year. And it used to be the case, say, you wouldn't take time off, or you try not to take time off during the season because there's games. Now sometimes there's actually an argument like that. you've got to be around for transfer season.
We should point out actually at this point that it's not just David and Fabrizio. There's people like Christian Falk in Germany, who I think we might touch on a little bit later. A guy called Florian Plettenberg, I think, and then various people who I've got to admit seem to have sort of credentials and palmares, I suppose, that make them look like reliable journalists. But at the same time, part of me thinks that Indy Kyler gets as many right as they do, so I'm not quite sure who's legitimate and who's not.
It is one true. It's a real kind of social media friendly form of journalism as well, because essentially there are potential actors who could fake it through that. Just kind of refashioning a little bit of news, constantly churning stuff out. Suddenly you look like, and also there is a self-perpetuating thing there. The more you kind of pump this stuff out, suddenly people start to come to you.
Well, and there's also, you can see a whisper somewhere, and if you actually can track it down, and you don't have to sort of fake it. So I mean, my only transfer exclusive, bearing in mind that, and I can't believe I kind of did this, but like, do you remember when we went to Vukovar? Were any of you in Vukovar? Were you in Vukovar, Rory?
In Serbia?
In Croatia. Quite a key difference. No. Quite important, that. We went to Vukovar. We did. We sat in the library together in Vukovar, didn't we? Having interviewed Sinisa Mihailovic's maths teacher. That was you, wasn't it?
No.
Was it Ames?
Might be Amesy.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry.
We're easily confused.
So anyway, I've been in Vukovar. Had to rush to Milan for a prize giving thing. Ferran Soriano, who wasn't at the height of his fame then, but was still the CEO at Manchester City, was also getting a prize. And he told me, oh yeah, City going to sign 4 players this summer. And it never occurred to me that was a story, so I didn't write it. And sure enough, they signed 4 players. And I was like, oh shit, like I could have just written that, and that would have... But anyway, I didn't write that. The only transfer I've ever had was Andrea Sharvin going to Arsenal. And that was because Duncan White, who's a friend of ours, before he gave up football journalism to be a professor at Harvard, as an interesting career move. He had the story that Arsenal were going to sign him, but couldn't sort of write it because it would have exposed his contact. So he got me to use my contacts in St. Petersburg to chase it up. They were sort of slightly baffled that anybody had it or that anybody really cared. And we just, of course it's happening. Yeah, it'll be this much. He'll probably move on Thursday. And so, obviously went in under my byline and Duncan's because he could then write the Arsenal side of it. But yeah, that was... Yeah, if I got a whisper on social media, this is pre-social media days, that Arsenal were about to make a big signing, you could work out the kind of player they needed. You could work out a Sharvin was probably about to leave Zenit because he'd just won the UEFA Cup. Yeah, you could have put 2 and 2 together, made some calls in St. Petersburg, and you could have got that story relatively easily. So it's not even faking it. You can use social media stuff to kind of actually write proper stories. I mean, that is kind of journalism.
I do like the idea of these people at Zenit being like, Jonathan, normally you ask esoteric tactics questions. Why do you now ask us about transfers? I think it's okay to do Russian accents these days. I thought there was a point a little while ago where Fabrizio, just to come back to what Mid said about certain clubs embracing it more than others. Occasionally Fabrizio Romano will run a story in particular. I think Ornstein, and I say this with great affection, is kind of a completist. I think David finds it very hard to get a whisper of something and not think that is worth reporting. I think he's an equal opportunities reporter in many ways. Like if he gets a story about Sunderland signing somebody, he will do it and chase it. Maybe not with quite the same fervour as he would if it was a Man United signing a player from Real Madrid or whatever, but he'll do it and chase it just because that's kind of in his nature. Whereas Romano has a couple of times run stories that I think are a little bit, for someone who's much more social media focused, that aren't really worth it from a hits point of view or a likes point of view. And I wonder, I can't prove it and I don't know, so I'm going to say allegedly in the hope that covers us legally. I think there are certain cases where clubs say to Fabrizio Romano, we would quite like it if you put this transfer and gave it the here we go. I think that is a thing that happens.
Well, haven't some clubs actually had him on their social media accounts?
Well, I know that he's hosted events for Parma in Italy, who have an American owner, and I wonder if that's part of it. And I think that he's done stuff. I think he's announced deals for Valencia before. And again, that's not to accuse him of corruption. I think that would be ridiculous. But it does. It does highlight maybe that this is more than journalism. Like, you're not just an observer to what's happening; you're a participant in it, which is, I think,
It's the entertainment point, isn't it? It's like it transfers as part of like a big spectacle as opposed to pure news that has to be reported.
So why do we think that is? Why this is? Let's do some COD psychology. Why do we think that transfers are this source of endless fascination, and someone gets bonus points if you make an original point about this subject, which has admittedly been discussed before?
So making the original point is difficult, but I think one of the reasons people love transfers is because of Fantasy League and because of Football Manager. That's when they sort of play at being managers, that's sort of the main bit of the fun bit of the game. Suddenly signing Emil Costadino for Sunderland, for instance. That was a great day for the people at Wearside. So it's partly that, but it's kind of it's a bit like how, in many ways, the draw for the World Cup is better than the World Cup.
Yeah,
because you imagine all those teams in their perfect form, with everybody in form and everybody fit, and you think, fully fit Cameroon against a fully fit South Korea. And then it actually gets to the tournament and there's 6 Cameroonians missing because of bonus disputes, another 3 of them are injured, and 2 of them have fallen out with the coach, and it's this sort of half-strength Cameroon, and it's all a bit, they're going to be crap, and they are crap. And it's the same with a transfer, that you imagine. The truth is that the vast majority of footballers in the Premier League are not that different from each other in terms of skill level. There's outliers, obviously, but fundamentally there's a big sort of sludge in the middle. And what makes them good or not less good is the environment in which they find themselves, their form, their fitness, the tactics, their teammates, the manager. But you can sort of ignore all of that and just assume you get the pure form of that player. And then that allows you to write these sort of imaginary kind of screeds on tactically, this is where he'll fit in, this is how Florian Wirtz will link up with Dominic Szoboszlai, and it probably means a lesser role for McAllister this season or whatever. Or you think, Wirtz is going to play as a false 9, and that means that Liverpool can sell Luis Diaz. You can write those things without any of the complications if it turns out Wirtz gets to Liverpool and for some reason he hates the wind off the Irish Sea, and he can't stand the sight of a liver bird. He's just allergic to the liver bird for inexplicable reasons that nobody could have predicted, and it all falls apart. There's no danger of that. You get the perfect player, and so it's more like a computer game. And a computer game is to actual football as a 1.5 hour ITV detective drama is to real police work. It's the comforting, simplified version of it, where it all works out fine in the end.
That's exactly, the thought I've always had in this is exactly that. Imagined, idealised football. And it's why actually I wouldn't get too sniffy about people's fascination with transfers, because ultimately, I suppose, it offers hope and the idea of growth. And it's exactly that. When, in the middle of transfer season, people see that their club is going to sign these 3 players. I'm thinking at the moment, say, Arsenal, they want a striker, they want a midfielder in Zubimendi, they want a wing forward. And there's this kind of vision, obviously. Well, if we get those 3, and maybe these specific players, this is our perfect team. And then you get into the whole idea of imagining how the whole thing is going to work and how it fits together. And as Jonathan has said, you don't at that point see that maybe by the time it gets to the first game of the season, one of the players carrying an injury, some key part of the team is missing. And it's almost become the Manchester United problem, because for the past few summers, say, United have actually made some pretty big signings. I think, again, there's hope around it, there's optimism. People on social media using phrases like, we're cooking now and all this sort of thing. And then they get out and play like Brighton or something like that, and the team falls apart as Brighton walk through them. Something that has happened repeatedly as well. But I think it's that kind of imagination that the idea of that drives so much of this fascination with who can we get, who are we going to get, what's going to happen.
Do you think that this is something that's always occurred to me? And I say this, I should confess, I'm a sucker for a transfer rumour. I really love a transfer rumour, both involving my club and more generally, because I always think it's interesting to think of what a player might look like. So like Franco Mastruantuono, the Argentinian player who's really going to need to get rid of that surname if he's going to be a superstar. That's not going to work for anybody. Not easy to be branded. Just be Franco. But I'm like, He's an 17-year-old Argentinian wonder kid. Maybe don't be Franco. Sorry, I didn't. Yeah, maybe don't be Franco. Maybe it's Real Madrid. Maybe be Franco. Anyway. But like, I'm really keen to see, like, how will he do in Europe? Is he going to be a rival to Lamine Yamal? Is he going to be a bit more of a success or an immediate success than Endrick? That's intriguing. It's interesting to see players come through. It's interesting to see players kind of in different positions. You look at someone like Rafinha, who was pretty good at Leeds, maybe, but then suddenly it's just like amazing at Barcelona. You never know, as Jonathan says, you never know how players will thrive in different contexts under different coaches. So I'm a sucker for a transfer rumour. But one thing that always strikes me is that fans generally, get much more excited about a player from abroad than a player from the Premier League. And I think part of that is a kind of latent, lingering exoticism that, the top scorer in Serie A, or, whatever. The top scorer in Serie A was Matteo Retegui, who's not very good. But, some exciting number 10 from Serie A is in some way more glamorous and more kind of appealing than the guy from Brentford. But I think a lot of it is because the guy from Brentford a lot more. You've seen him play. You know that, Bryan Mbeumo, who I love as a player, your team beat a team containing Bryan Mbeumo last season. So actually, if you sign him, maybe he's not going to be the solution to all your problems. Whereas the guy that you've barely ever seen play, is even for all the ease with which you watch foreign football now, for all the data, for all the the YouTube sizzle reels, a lot of people still don't watch a lot of football.
Actually, on that as well, an irrelevant question, I think. Can you remember, were people excited when Liverpool signed Salah? Because we're talking about someone who's actually, say, fulfilled this imagined idea, probably gone beyond that. He's become like this superstar, and he's been decisive in like 2 Premier League titles and a Champions League. There was really kind of none of that anticipation when he signed in 2017, was there?
No, but I think this is one of the things about transfer culture, which is the wanky phrase I use to talk about it. Is its diminishing returns. So when I first started out as a journalist, if you'd have got Bournemouth or equivalent mid-table Premier League team to spend, 10 million quid on a midfielder, that might have been like a splash. That might have made a back page. Certainly on like a daily newspaper, you probably would have splashed that. That's a big transfer. Now, like when Bournemouth signed Dango Ouattara, I'm not even sure it was printed anywhere. He just appeared, and I can't remember how much Ouattara cost, but it would have been a substantial sum of money. I don't remember anyone reporting that Bournemouth had signed Justin Kluivert. He was just there one day. And I think the irony is that the amount we think about transfers now, the amount that like people talk about transfers and the number of transfers that happen, I actually think the excitement levels that any individual transfer generates is probably smaller than it used to be, because we're so
there's also and there's also, I think people now are wary of the danger of, Arsenal fans celebrating signing Mesut Ozil, and that almost felt like it was compensating for the fact they hadn't won a trophy for ages. And then, we spent, was it 45 million they spent on him? 42.5 million. We spent 42.5 million on Mesut Ozil, and literally fans in the street celebrating around the Emirates, which is bizarre. Which then, obviously, the reality, however good you think Ozil was or wasn't for Arsenal, the reality can never live up to. Even in Turkey, those enormous sort of celebrations at the airport as Darius Vassell turns up or whoever, they seem to have diminished.
Galatasaray signed Leroy Sané the other day on a free, and it was the same. It was the same as that. I wonder to an extent now whether it's a performed tradition. They're not doing it because they're actually excited. They're just like, well, what we do when we sign somebody is we go to the airport and set off a load of flares. That's what we do. They do it in Rome as well.
Is a key to that as well that actually this is a situation where you don't want to be too efficient in your transfer business. You don't want to just suddenly start the summer and sign 3 amazing players, because the longer a transfer goes on without resolution, it kind of builds this anticipation. You don't want to get it too far, because then like suddenly it becomes this kind of frustrated aspect to it. But it does build that we need this guy, and you can see it at the moment again with Arsenal, kind of in terms of the Sesko and Gyökeres dynamic.
The reverse of that, maybe producer Tom, who is a Brighton fan, can sort of nod or shake his head, possibly even talk. I'm not sure if he does that, if that would breach some kind of contract. But the best, the club who've performed best in the Premier League in terms of transfers over the last 5 years is Brighton. Maybe Brentford, one of the two. But do Brighton fans celebrate? Oh, brilliant! We got another 17-year-old Uruguayan that we haven't heard of. Yeah, oh, fantastic! We got a 16-year-old Ecuadorian we've never heard of. And yet, that is actually the way you do business well. It's not going out and spending, 60 million on Matthias Cunha. Hang on, let's let Tom do a facial expression.
Producer Tom has interjected and said that Brighton don't particularly get excited by individual transfers. They the players arrive, they basically now expect them to be great in 2 years' time, and then I presume at some point they realise that they'll be sold to Chelsea.
And to be clear,
the way you interact with it.
To be clear, the reason why he can't speak himself is not because he's a terrorist or anything like that. He doesn't have to be voiced. It's just to do with the recording software that the producer can't be recorded.
I am interested, though, Mids, in that idea that it's in the club's interests to drag stuff out to an extent. We've seen in lots of different ways that clubs now regard themselves as content factories. Most teams now do these kind of behind-the-scenes social media docs. They increasingly will the number of interviews that you see in your printed newspapers are now much smaller because clubs basically want to do them themselves. They don't see why they should kind of support independent media who are, profit-making companies rather than just doing it themselves and getting them subscribers. This is very conspiratorial. Is there an argument then that if you are thinking as a football team and as a content business, you don't just go and do the deal really fast? There was a I'll give away my allegiances later, but there was the summer in which I think Liverpool had signed in 2018. Liverpool signed Fabinho within about 36 hours of losing the Champions League final in Kiev, and I don't think I'd seen a single link between Liverpool and Fabinho at that stage. I think he was just the first time you ever saw Liverpool connected with Fabinho was when Fabinho was holding up a Liverpool shirt. Almost. I might be doing a disservice to the journalist on the Merseyside beat, but it was very fast. That's great from a transfer business point of view, but it's terrible content.
Yeah. Oh, is this something the Club World Cup articulates a little bit? In that a certain strand of executive wants it because of everything it means commercially, because of what it can mean for the profile of the club. And yet, if you're in the football department and basically want to have the best possible team to win the league and Champions League, well, you can do without all this. Genuine, I think, an element with both of those. Almost a classic of this, and maybe. It's actually probably a bit of a dividing line in football, in the football transfer media industrial complex or transfer culture, whatever you call it. It's Man United's signing of Pogba in the summer of 2016. It was a traditional saga and it went on for months, comparable, say, to United trying to sign Van Persie in 2012. But it was the way that saga then built into this social media thing that the club themselves very much drove. They even had the hashtag Pogback. And I think, actually, if I'm not mistaken, and maybe Fabrizio correcting this himself, was that the one, I think, where Fabrizio went from kind of like a known transfer reporter to suddenly someone who was this...
The big beast.
Yeah, this phenomenon.
It might have been. I think he might have had one earlier. I think that might have been a big one earlier as well. But it was...
Was it Higuain, maybe?
Pogba did feel... See, to me, Higuain is the kind of nadir or zenith of that transfer obsessions. I remember being at the Emirates Cup in 2013 and he was booed by Arsenal fans.
Jesus.
He was playing for Napoli, despite the fact that Arsenal had never made a bid for him. They'd just been linked with him. And as he'd then been perceived to choose Napoli over Arsenal, he got booed, which, if you're an Arsenal fan and that's how you've kind of engaged with it, makes perfect sense. But Arsenal had never made a bid, and yet this random Argentine guy was now an enemy of Arsenal Football Club, which is a status that has since been conferred on all of PGMOL. But Pogba, you might be right. Pogba, because it was the first one that was kind of properly, it's a bit of a Delaney word, properly weaponized for social media, Pogba. It was there was a whole strategy. Did they announce him with Stormzy? Am I getting that right?
I can't remember. I remember because I was actually in Spain at the time. I remember just for about 24 hours, this wall of noise around it. And actually, it's almost worth a podcast itself, that just in terms of what that represented. Because, of course, the Pogba thing is also a classic of the imagined idea of what he was going to be like to what actually happened.
There's also, do you know what? There's a great 6-part podcast series to do on how Paul Pogba explains modern football. I am patenting that. If any other rival podcast producers steal it, I will know where you got it. The other thing that kind of Pogba maybe speaks to, Jonathan, is that was as high profile a transfer as I can remember, really, apart from Ronaldo to Real Madrid, the kind of second Galactico era. And it very obviously didn't work. So should that not have kind of watered down our enthusiasm for big money transfers?
That was the first time the Premier League had broken the world transfer record
Since Shearer.
Since Shearer, yeah. So, long time. But I mean, big transfers often don't work, or they don't work for footballing reasons, and that's another complication. When the Florian Wirtz deal is done, and by the time you listen to this, it may well be done because it's clearly imminent, he will become the 10th 9-figure transfer. So the 10th player to be sold for £100 million or more. You look at the other 9, and okay, you can say Declan Rice had a good season, and great things may come of that. Caicedo, something similar. Enzo Fernandez, something similar. Those are sort of pending. But there's some of them, like João Felix is still the 3rd most expensive player in history. Like, good player, but already at 25, he just seems to be on this endless carousel of disappointing loans. Griezmann going to Barcelona, a clear disaster. Coutinho going to Barcelona, a clear disaster. Even the biggest two, Neymar and Mbappe, you can make some kind of case that PSG benefited from a brand point of view, but from a football point of view, those deals didn't work. From a football point of view, they didn't win the Champions League, and if you're PSG and the French title comes as red, then the Champions League is the only thing worth playing for. So, I don't even know how you begin to look at the figures to say, did this make sense from a commercial point of view? But it didn't make any sense. Didn't work from a football point of view. And I guess then you get into this whole other argument. I mean, partly, to what extent was there a deliberate attempt to inflate the market? But also, is holding the world transfer record, is that a goal in and of itself? I suspect for Florentino Perez, it absolutely is a goal, because it says we are the biggest club in the world.
Well, there is a very significant point, because we haven't touched on this yet, actually, in that just how central Madrid and Barcelona, particularly Madrid, I would say, are to this whole industry. Right down to the way that, going back 25 years ago, before any of this was a thing, Madrid made a point of basically having their signings as if they were film premieres and creating a summer of noise. And I remember, I'd go to Spain every summer, and the Fichajes culture, the transfers, that Marca and AS, that's when, or Mundo Deportivo, that's when they came alive. And of course, just to bring that point full circle, I mean, Hazard and Griezmann, they were both signed in summer 2019, and that was really the end of an era in some ways. It took an era to a kind of a level that it couldn't really sustain anymore. So suddenly you've got the two major clubs in this new world where suddenly they're getting quite agitated because of the rise of the Premier League, the state-owned clubs, as Perez constantly railed against. And then in this summer 2019, where they're kind of in a difficult situation, they both make these massive gesture signings for Hazard and Griezmann for players in their late 20s, both for huge money. Now, we do have a kind of a total outlier then in the pandemic happening the next year. But what happened with the pandemic specifically, of course, was that exposed all these fault lines that were unsustainable. And the response to that was basically the Super League. And now, and in Madrid's case, actually, and it's funny how it's coming back around again. Madrid had to completely rethink their transfer model. They had to think like a Brighton or a super deluxe Brighton, only to the point now they're back round again and trying to sign superstars.
Well, I think they're doing it in an interesting kind of dual way, aren't they? They've worked out that they can whisper in the ear of players and say, "Run your contract down." It's how they got Alaba, it's how they got Rudiger, it's how they got Trent Alexander-Arnold, and then they and I think this is a subject we'll try and touch on in the relatively near future. They've basically looked at what Porto and Lyon and maybe Udinese did for a long time and thought, well, we might as well just do that. Why are we paying these other people to do it for us? But they, I think, the one thing that was lost in that kind of endless screed about how much Real and Barcelona and stuff needed more money was they want to spend it on transfers.
Yeah, the wage rate. They wanted to spend on the wage rate specifically.
Yeah, they are like, well, we want to make as much money as possible so that we can pay for players and pay their wages and pay their agents. I mean, like that's what it's for. So it's maybe like you used the word sniffy before, mate. It's like maybe it's not even sniffy to kind of be slightly to act like you're a bit above transfer culture, which I do. Maybe it's actually really stupid because transfer culture is central to football. That is what the biggest clubs in the world are thinking about all of the time. Which I feel is probably a point at which to take a short break for some slightly erotic music, and then should we talk about a transfer? Welcome back. I'm Rory Smith, and I'm joined by Miguel Delaney and Jonathan Wilson. We touched on it already a little bit, but we think that this podcast will come out possibly on the day that Florian Wirtz has his Liverpool medical. The plan seemed to be, presuming he doesn't fail it, that he'd be announced like either Friday or Saturday as the most expensive player in British history. That's important. It's important that we say British, because we have to have outspent the Strots. But also as, Jonathan, what was it, fourth most expensive player of all time? Fifth most expensive player of all time?
Oh, well, this is a problem though, because, what do you count? Do you count the basic 100 million or do you count the 16 million add-ons? So if you count it as 116 million, it's actually more than João Felix. But then, of course, João Felix was sold in euros, not in pounds, and maybe the conversion doesn't make any sense anyway. But yeah, if it's 116, it would put him behind only Neymar and Mbappe. If it's 100, then he's joined seventh? Joined seventh with Grealish, Rice and Caicedo.
Also, there's a weird thing here where, even though it's a huge transfer, it doesn't feel as kind of bombastic or sensational, say, as was it Christian Vieri going for 30 million towards the end of the 90s, and the Pope describing it as, an offence against the dignity of work and all this sort of thing. Or it would have been Pope John Paul II, I think.
Was he a woke Pope?
Was that definitely about Vieri? Was it not about Lentini?
Oh, maybe it was Lentini, but Lentini's another one though. I suppose there was 13 million. And that felt so huge. Whereas obviously 13 million. Wirtz, depending on what calculation we use, first could be 100 million more. Some of this obviously is inflation and industry adjusted, but it's why I always find the kind of discussion about kind of the biggest ever, slightly kind of just skewed by that, because it's all about, I suppose, the context of when it happened.
I remember talking to someone, I can't remember who it was, who said that you should actually think about it. It might have been Marcotti. That you should actually think about the proportion of a club's revenue that the deal represents. Yeah. If Liverpool are doing 100 million on Wirtz, but they've got projected revenues of 700 million, then that is less money to them, effectively, than a club with revenues of 100 million paying 25 million for a player. So it is all relative, and it is difficult to compare fees across eras. Jonathan, you talked a little bit before about how a lot of big money transfers haven't worked in the traditional sense. Do you not think that's a bit weird, given all we know about how recruitment works now, and how much information that the clubs have available, and how scientific a lot of these clubs are, and how you go through that list of top 10 players, there's no lack of talent anywhere. It is really strange that there's such a low hit rate, effectively. As you say, there are 3 that are kind of pending. I think Rice to Arsenal has been a success. That's fine. I don't think it's been an earth-shattering success, but it's been a success. Caicedo, some Chelsea fans seem to really like, some aren't that.
Well, he's probably their best player, best outfield player over the whole of last season. Obviously, Cole Palmer had a much better start, but
someone said to me that Lavia looks like their most impressive midfielder, though.
And he's barely played, though, has he? That's Lavia certainly has looked good when he's played, but he's been injured for a lot of the season.
Yeah, and that is a factor. If your caveat of he's really good, but he doesn't play very much, that's like a big caveat. That's a massive asterisk. And then Enzo, I think nobody really disputes that Enzo was an inflated price post World Cup, but he's not been a disastrous signing. He's probably not been amazing. Why?
So I think it's because you talked about how scientific a lot of signings are. I think the biggest signings aren't done scientifically. I think they're done, if not on a whim, then certainly by sort of presidential decree or by clubs who maybe they're not just looking to get the best player at the best price. They're quite happy to pay the big fee to make statements. So, 2 of that top 10 are Barcelona with the Neymar money burning a hole in their pocket, panicking. Tarek told us a story about when they got Ousmane Dembele, and not really knowing how they're going to use him, not really knowing his personality, not really knowing anything about him other than he's a promising kid we can get. Let's get him. Coutinho, they seem to have no idea how they're going to use. That within a month it was obvious that signing hadn't worked. And they spent, over 100 million quid on him. 112 million pounds, I think it was. More. Neymar and Mbappe, as we say. Sorry?
Coutinho was more than that. Coutinho was up towards 140.
Okay, well, again, it depends what add-ons you include. The Neymar signing is the sort of earth-shattering one because that more than doubled the previous transfer record. If you look down, if you just go to Wikipedia, look down the list of world transfer records. In the 1890s, it's a bit weird. I suspect we don't actually know what fees were being paid, and it sometimes leaps from sort of £100 to £400. But essentially, from 1900 onwards, the world transfer record sort of goes up on a fairly steady trajectory. There's little spikes, and then suddenly it doubles, and that's not something that's ever happened before. And so that was a signing. Okay, they had to pay that to match his buyout clause, but there was a point being made there, and there was clearly a desire to get back at Barcelona after Barcelona had beaten them 6-1 to overturn the 4-0 first leg deficit in the Champions League. Partly it's saying we are PSG, we can do what we want, we can afford anything. Partly maybe, I don't know, there was a realisation inflating the market meant there was fewer competing clubs and would really hammer the more traditionally funded clubs. Partly, I think it was a realisation that getting Neymar gave them markets in Brazil, got Nike on board. There's all kinds of sort of side benefits to that. But it was a signing that, from a football point of view, that fee made zero sense.
Let's not forget as well.
From an impact on the market point of view, that signing worked perfectly, Miguel.
But on that, I mean, I don't know. I'm going to make what you would consider a very predictable point. It is in the book States of Play. But let's not. What was the other context of that summer? Qatar is being blockaded by Saudi Arabia and UAE, or by a coalition led by Saudi Arabia and UAE. And suddenly, if you've got at a point where you need focus on your country to sign, to have a constant guarantee of rolling news, especially in another saga that went back and forth, that's like waving a massive flag in the middle of all that. And suddenly, as we say it, like the transfer market almost becomes collateral. Really, the global football economy becomes, something collaterally impacted by much bigger stories. And it did. Like, I mean, I have heard from people in football are convinced that one of the motivations behind that transfer was to raise fees and wages to a point where they felt fewer clubs could compete. And look at Barcelona, as we saw directly, they drove themselves mad trying to compete, really, or try to even figure out what to do with the money.
So having said that, those other nine-figure transfers, there was Arsenal signing Rice. Maybe they just thought that was the fee. Fair enough. Chelsea, I think, were making a point that we're still here after Abramovich. It's almost a sense they could spend more because they'd worked out you could amortise over a long period. There's other things going on there. But I think it's just the high end of a fee for a player of that ability, that range of attributes at that age. He's 22, he scores goals, he sets goals up, he's brilliant at pressing. There's absolutely zero sign of a disruptive ego. You can use both feet. You can play in a range of different positions. So even if you're looking at a squad building point of view, he strengthens you in loads of different areas. Because it might be that number 10 ends up being his prime position, but in an injury crisis, he could play as a false nine. He could play a bit deeper. He could play on the left. There's loads of things he could do, and that means you don't have to go out and sign a whole load of backup players because he gives you that opportunity to shuffle people around and give you backup. So I feel that, I mean, maybe you can say Rice is the first £100 million player where the fee is about appropriate to his capacities. But Wirtz, I think, definitely looks like this might look very silly by the middle of September when he looks dreadful and can't cope with the pace of the Premier League and is alleged of a liver bird. But I understand from a football point of view why you would want him. It doesn't seem that outrageous a sum for a player of that profile, that age, and that experience.
I spoke to someone who is well positioned to know this about Wirtz the other day. Just on, we were talking about something else, and that it sort of came up. And he said he's all things to all men. That he is 22. He's potentially one of the best attacking players in the world for the next 8 or 9 years. You're getting him at his peak, and he compared it to Liverpool signing Van Dijk, who was the best in class central defender. Go and you pay what you need to get the best in class. Wirtz is the best in class. You just go and get him. And the thing that it's reminded me of was, to bring it back to Mesut Ozil. We're really dating ourselves as a podcast. Our references are all like 10, 11 years old.
Or 30 in some cases. Or 100.
I mean, let's be honest. You, if you're getting me on 10-year-old references, you're doing pretty well.
When Arsenal signed Ozil, I was in the middle of this is a real name dropping episode. I was in the middle of an email correspondence with Billy Bean, who was an enthusiastic podcast listener, and it is possible that Billy Bean listens to this podcast. I don't know. If you do, hi,
hello.
Billy. Sorry, I'm about to breach a confidence. But we were just in this kind of ongoing conversation, and I said to him, Arsenal had just signed that deal with StatDNA, so they were kind of at the forefront of analytics, sort of. They were trying to kind of find value in the market. Billy is kind of an Arsenal fan, I think. That's his football team more than anybody else. And I said, Ozil doesn't, paying 42.5 million quid for Mesut Ozil doesn't strike me as being very Moneyball. What do you make of it? And he said that one of the things that was missed about Moneyball is that you pay the premium for game-winning, match-winning, season-defining talent. That is in the book rather than the film. It's in Michael Lewis's book. That if you see someone who you think is undervalued by the market, no matter what the price is, you go and get them at whatever the cost because they're undervalued. And Arsenal clearly felt that with Ozil. Billy Bean's view was Mesut Ozil was a Moneyball signing. And I think to an extent Liverpool have looked at Wirtz in the same way. They thought, right, well, this guy is that the upside is so potentially huge that he's worth that massive cost. As a Liverpool fan, I'm a little. It feels a bit weird to me that they're paying that much money for a player. I can't remember. I know there was Van Dijk and Alisson that both broke various records for a bit, but Liverpool don't strike me as being a kind of natural, paying £100 million for a player club. Maybe they are. Maybe that's me being outdated. But there is this weird double thing, isn't there? There's a double standard, Miguel, that we've talked about a little bit privately, where fans, and we probably all do this, so we shouldn't kind of act like we're above it, simultaneously want their club to spend a lot of money to flex their muscles, but once they do, want to downplay how much money they've spent. Because I think on some level we all realise that if your team is the most expensive and you win everything, it doesn't feel quite as special.
Yeah, maybe it feels like the achievement doesn't have the same merit. On the Wirtz point, just before we get onto that, I suppose, and like this touched on this goes into something we were going to talk, or we planned to talk about. It was so wide ranging in terms of how fans need to have suddenly they have to have knowledge of concepts like amortization and all sorts of accounting terms. That's part of the game now, but part of the discussion around the game. But with Wirtz, do you not feel as if Liverpool basically went for what people would perceive as quote unquote Moneyball signings, since basically that classic trio of Firmino, Salah, and Mane kind of went, and none of them have fully worked out. They're still so dependent on Salah. So as a response to that, despite the fact that Diaz has been good, Darwin, just we don't have to get into a discussion there. Essentially, they've did, as you said, did exactly what they did with Van Dijk. Well, let's just go and make sure. And Wirtz seems kind of as sure a thing as you're going to get at the moment.
Is that a bit harsh on McAllister? I think McAllister's been great.
But as a midfielder, though, he's a midfielder rather than a forward line. Sorry.
Okay, you're only talking about forwards.
Yeah,
okay.
I'm talking about their forward line.
No, even so, I think Miguel's right. I think McAllister was very much of this guy's clearly under. I mean, they paid 35 million up front for him, plus
that seems so low now.
It's ridiculous. He's clearly one of the best midfielders in the world, and Liverpool will have a problem in a couple of years when Real Madrid decide they want to sign him. That is the Alexis McAllister arc. Gravenberch they watched for a couple of years and then got him on the cheap, because the one thing that I think is really important to remember with Liverpool is they don't forget. Even Chiesa, who hasn't worked out, and according to Fabrizio Romano, will leave this summer. He is thinking of going back to Fabrizio, who again I say this with affection, does these video updates where he says the same thing in 3 different sentences, and it's enough to get. But they must work again. Like, it's weird what the medium encourages us to do, but like it's basically Federico Chiesa hasn't played at Liverpool, so he wants to go back to Italy, and he'll say it in 3 different ways, and that's the video. But Liverpool have been watching Chiesa since about 2020, and he became available for near enough nothing in modern football terms, and they thought, well, we might as well. Let's just see what happens. Yeah. The same with Gravenberch. They watched him when they were trying to sign Bellingham, or when they were thinking about, or they were distracted by the idea of Bellingham. And I think that they'll have had their eye on Wirtz for a long time. They do their research. They must look at it and think, this is, like you say, Midge, this is as close to a sure thing as possible. But in a weird way, that's almost not that. Yeah, it's almost not that dramatic. So it feels a bit like, yes, this is a sensible club doing a sensible thing despite the fee involved, which makes it feel a bit less.
But and also a point to mention that we've spent about an hour now talking about like transfer fees, where anyone in football worth their salt, and we mentioned this in the show the other day, the real metric is actually what you can pay a player. And that works all the way down, because a transfer fee can be so variable. Whereas even if you're kind of a club of a slightly lower financial bracket, they would always say the issue isn't what they can go out and pay a player, or what they can go out and pay for a player. It's even if, and this is where the PSG point and Neymar is so crucial, if the market is suddenly inflated by 40 grand per player, say, just the way it works, suddenly where one contract at the top creates demands lower down. And this was a classic problem that Barcelona had, where when Messi's contract kept getting renegotiated, then suddenly that creates this internal stress, and clubs who had a budget and Madrid found this problem again around 2018, 2019. They had a budget for a certain wage level. Well, suddenly all their best players, because they've got interest, because the market has changed, they want a higher wage, and suddenly the clubs at that level, they just can't they can't maintain that. And that is, I mean, we mentioned again the 90% correlation between wage bill and where you finish, but that is why it's so important, and it's why wage bill, rather than actually what you can pay in transfer fees, is a true indication of a club's actual financial power in that regard.
Right, well, I think that'll probably do. And Miguel saying we've done an hour on transfers makes me think that the hypocrisy and the irony is probably running out. Miguel, thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Enjoy the heat. A reminder that we do have an email address, which bafflingly is liberopodcast0@gmail.com. That was Bruin's fault. We've had a lot of correspondence. We really appreciate it, even the ones that accuse Jonathan Wilson of various things that are not fair. But if you'd like...
To be fair, as one person, he just sent lots of emails.
It's one guy who really hates Wilson. If you'd like to email Jonathan some abuse, feel free. And we will be back, I think, with more transfer-related stuff next week.